Hello, my name is Margaret Jensen, and this is not just a story about a mother left outside a celebration. It's about years of quiet sacrifice being erased by your own blood and what happens when you finally say enough. I spent my life building a home for my family, brick by brick, memory by memory. But when I showed up to my son's grand anniversary dinner, I learned I wasn't even part of the guest list. And that was only the beginning. Margaret sat on the old wooden chair by the window, gazing at the lavender blooming in the garden and waiting for an invitation that never came. The scent of the late summer afternoon drifted through the gauzy curtains. Warm light slanted across the floorboards, catching motes of dust that swirled lazily in the air. Margaret's fingers curled around the ceramic teacup, now lukewarm, as she shifted slightly, eyes still fixed on the driveway. There was no car, no knock on the door, no fluttering envelope tucked in the mailbox. Just silence. And the wind. Last night a message had arrived from Diane. Just one line. "Do you have plans this weekend?" That was it. No greeting, no smiley face. Margaret had read it a dozen times, even reread it at midnight, lying on her side, staring at the faint glow of her phone screen. Something about it had tugged at her, not just its vagueness, but the air of obligation beneath it, as though Diane had asked not out of care, but duty. Molly, the small black and white terrier, pawed at Margaret's feet, resting her chin on the hem of her skirt. Margaret reached down and stroked the dog's head, the rhythm steady, comforting. "Maybe they're busy," she murmured. 20 years is something to celebrate. She hadn't known about the anniversary until this morning. It was Helen, the neighbour across the road, who mentioned it in passing. "I saw Michael and Diane's anniversary post. Can you believe it's been 20 years already?" That was followed by a brief pause and a slightly awkward smile. "I'm sure you'll be heading over this weekend." Margaret smiled, then falsely bright. "Oh, I'll probably be in the garden. Those lilies need attention." But later, when Helen had gone and the dishes sat untouched in the sink, Margaret opened Facebook. There it was. A lavish photo of Michael and Diane smiling beside a golden banner that read, "Happy 20th Anniversary." The table behind them gleamed with crystal glasses, layers of cake silver balloons floating gently above. There were comments from friends, cousins, colleagues. One read, "Beautiful celebration last night. Thank you for having us." But Margaret hadn't been there. She hadn't even known it was happening. She clicked through the photos, slowly noting every detail. The centerpiece of roses, the gold-etched wine glasses, the familiar porch of Michael's house in the background. Her own absence rang louder than any caption. Not a mention, not a tag, nothing. She dialed Michael's number, straight to voicemail. She sent a message to Diane. "Looks like a lovely event. Hope everything went well." Diane responded an hour later with nothing but a laughing emoji. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed her phone. The afternoon wore on. The tea went cold. The lavender outside swayed gently in the wind. Margaret remained by the window, silent, except for the soft clicking of her knitting needles. The pale pink yarn curled around her fingers, forming slow, methodical loops. The same yarn she had used in a scarf she made for Diane years ago, one winter when they were still trying. Later that evening, as the sky bruised into dusk and the birds returned to their nests, Margaret opened the wooden cabinet in the hallway. Inside was an old photo album, thick, dusty, with worn leather corners. She sat down with it at the dining table, Molly at her feet. She turned each page slowly. There it was, Michael's wedding day. Her boy, young and beaming in a navy suit. Diane beside him, radiant. Margaret in the front row wearing a soft lilac dress, her smile wide and proud. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What changed? She whispered to the silence. When did I stop being invited? She lingered over that photo, her face frozen in happiness from years ago, so different from the woman sitting here now, wrapped in layers of quiet. As she prepared for bed, folding the knitting back into its basket, her phone vibrated softly on the nightstand. A message. It was from Abby, her granddaughter. Grandma, I saw your picture in the wedding album today. You looked so beautiful. And that was all. No picture from today. No mention of the celebration. Just a memory. Of someone who had once belonged. The morning after the anniversary celebration, Margaret poured tea for 3, but only she sat down to drink. Steam curled upward from the teacup's delicate trails dancing toward the kitchen window. The sky was pale and soft with Sunday light, yet the air carried a faint chill enough for Margaret to pull her cardigan tighter. She sat alone at the round table, placing the cups carefully, one at each seat, as if by habit or quiet hope. Molly, her small terrier, lay curled beneath the table, unmoved by the ritual. The radio played something old and soft in the background. A man's voice from another decade singing about the moon and lost love. Margaret reached over and lowered the volume. Silence was kinder. The pink scarf sat folded beside her, half-finished. It had been meant for Abby started last winter with plans to gift it when the weather turned. Margaret had imagined handing it to her in person, maybe with a chuckle about the colour being too pink for a teenager. She had imagined the moment happening yesterday, but Abby hadn't seen her, because Margaret hadn't been there. She glanced at her phone. Overnight, new photos had flooded in from Diane's page, elegant decorations, a champagne toast, even a small band playing under twinkling fairy lights. There were close-ups of guests laughing, arms looped around one another, cheeks glowing with wine and warmth. Margaret tapped through them slowly, each one pulling her deeper into something she couldn't name. One image made her stop. Abby, radiant in a sea-green dress Margaret had never seen, holding a cupcake with glittery gold frosting. Her curls had been pinned back, a style Margaret remembered showing her how to do once years ago. She looked so grown up and so far away. Diane's caption read, "A perfect evening with our dearest loved ones, just family." The words sat heavy on Margaret's chest. She wanted to call. She wanted to ask why she hadn't been invited, why no one had mentioned it, why even Abby hadn't said a word. But instead, she opened the chat thread with her granddaughter and typed, "You looked lovely last night, sweetheart. How's school going?" Moments later, a bubble appeared. "Why didn't you come to the party, Grandma? I kept looking for you." Margaret stared at the screen, the words stinging more than she expected. She typed back slowly, then erased it, then typed again. "Oh, I had a bit of a cold. Didn't want to risk spreading anything." It was a lie, but a kind one maybe. She set the phone down, pushing the tea toward the empty chairs. She imagined the clinking of spoons, the soft laughter of conversation. Instead, only the wind outside tugging gently at the trees. Later that morning, Ruth from next door stopped by to return a baking dish. She lingered in the doorway, peering in. "Quiet weekend?" Ruth asked, gently, eyes flicking toward the untouched cups. "Oh, yes," Margaret replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just catching up on some gardening." Ruth hesitated. "I saw the pictures. Looked like quite the celebration." Margaret nodded, her voice light. "Yes, they do love a big gathering." Ruth shifted slightly as if waiting for more. When none came, she offered a brief smile and left. Alone again, Margaret wandered into the hallway. The old photo album sat where she'd left it the night before. She brushed her fingers across its cover but didn't open it. Her phone buzzed. A missed call from Michael. She froze, staring at the screen. No message, no explanation, just the echo of a ringing that had already stopped. She tapped to return the call. One ring, two, then call declined. Margaret lowered the phone slowly. The quiet was thicker now, pressing in around her. That afternoon, while tidying the desk drawer in the study, a drawer she rarely opened, Margaret noticed a cream-coloured envelope slipped beneath a stack of magazines. It had yellowed slightly at the corners, its edges crisp. She pulled it out and turned it over. Save the date. Michael and Diane. 20 years together. Her name was written in familiar handwriting. The stamp box was empty. It had never been sent. That afternoon, she discovered the Save the Date card under the desk drawer, her name written on it, but it had never been mailed. Margaret traced the outlines in her memory, trying to recall the last time her son looked at her with gratitude in his eyes. The attic smelled of dust and lavender, an odd pairing, one from neglect, the other from a sachet she'd tucked away years ago. Outside, rain fell gently on the roof, soft as a whisper. The sky had turned to a dull pewter matching her mood. She'd gone up to find a place for the pink scarf. It was neatly folded now, its threads cool and smooth beneath her fingers. Margaret paused before tucking it into a drawer, hesitating as if the act of putting it away might make something permanent. Maybe Abby's too old for this now, she murmured to no one. Maybe she won't need it anymore. The drawer closed with a muted thud. Behind her boxes stood in uneven stacks, years of family life distilled into labelled containers, Christmas school projects, Michael's drawings. She pulled one marked photos closer, brushing aside the cobwebs that clung like forgotten thoughts. Inside, albums with cracked spines waited patiently. She opened one. There was Abby as a toddler sitting on Margaret's lap, both of them laughing. She remembered that day, how Abby had insisted on wearing her fairy wings to the grocery store. Margaret had been the one to babysit every afternoon after school while Diane worked late. Back then, Diane would arrive flustered but grateful, often hugging Margaret at the door. "I don't know how we'd manage without you, Mum," she used to say. Margaret sighed and flipped to another page. Michael and Diane's wedding herself, seated proudly in the front row, wearing her best navy suit. She'd helped arrange the flowers, baked 3 dozen lemon tarts, held Diane's hand when the nerves kicked in. They'd called her the rock of the family. She lifted a folded paper tucked between pages. Her husband's handwriting looked softer, now the ink slightly faded. "If I go first," he had written, "promise me you'll always stay close to Michael. Don't let life wedge itself between you two." Her throat tightened. "I tried," she whispered. Rain tapped steadily against the small attic window. The sound felt like a clock ticking backward, winding her deeper into the past. She stood and opened a second box, this one with old household keepsakes. At the top was a framed photo slightly chipped at the corner. It had once stood on their living room shelf, Michael, Diane and Abby, seated on a park bench, sunlight spilling across their shoulders. There had been another version of this photo once, with Margaret beside them. This copy did not include her. She ran her fingers over the glass, noticing a fine crack running from Diane's shoulder to the edge. As if the picture itself knew something had broken. Another memory surfaced sharper than the others. Diane in the kitchen, her voice just a bit too tight. "I think we need to make our own choices now, Margaret. It's time we stand as a couple." It had been a moment, not cruel, not loud, but it left a bruise Margaret hadn't known how to heal. Since then, things had changed, not all at once, just a slow erosion like wind against stone. She placed the photo carefully on a shelf, leaning it back to hide the crack. Downstairs, the house had grown darker. The day had slipped past her without her noticing. She closed the attic door softly and made her way through the hallway. In the living room, Molly lifted her head and then rested it again. Margaret turned off the last lamp. As the house settled into silence, she paused in the doorway of her bedroom. A draught whispered through the frame. The wind had picked up just a little. She stood still. Somewhere in the rustling hush, a sound emerged, faint, like memory trying to speak. "Are you there, Mum?" When she turned off the light, Margaret heard the wind whistle through the crack in the door, carrying a voice faint and uncertain. "Are you there, Mum?" After 3 days of silence. Margaret finally dialed Michael's number, only to be met with an endless loop of hold music before the line went dead. The grey Wednesday morning mirrored her mood. The sky hung low, thick with clouds that seemed too tired to rain. A sharp wind crept under the door, brushing against her slippers. She had wrapped herself in a cardigan, but still felt cold, the kind of chill that settled deeper than skin. On the kitchen table, her phone buzzed softly. She watched the screen light up her own number, now logged as the latest outgoing call. No missed calls in return. No voicemail. Nothing. She glanced at the save the date card still lying under the salt jar, its edges slightly curled. She had placed it there days ago, hoping somehow it would vanish, maybe blown away by a breeze, or hidden under a pile of old newspapers. But it stayed. A silent witness. A forgotten truth. She sat back in her chair, breathing through the weight in her chest. A memory returned, uninvited. Michael maybe 15 years old, arms draped around her neck after his school recital. "You're the most important person in my life, Mum," he had whispered. His hair had smelled of sweat and triumph. She reached for the phone again and dialed. It rang once, then twice. Then the music began sterile distant, the kind of melody played in banks or waiting rooms. Not a sound that should exist between a mother and her child. Finally a click. "Hello?" His voice was low, clipped. "Michael?" she said softly, her hand gripping the receiver tightly. I thought I'd try again." A pause. She could hear typing in the background. "Now's not a good time, Mum. I'm in the middle of something." "Oh," she replied. "I just wanted to say hi. That's all." Another pause. Diane's swamped by the way he added, "She's been dealing with a lot lately." There was no warmth in his tone, no questions in return, no mention of the party. "I see," Margaret said. "I'll call you back, okay?" "Of course," she replied, knowing he wouldn't. The line went dead. For a moment, she held the phone to her ear, as if it might still carry some leftover echo. Then she set it down gently, as if afraid of waking something. She stood and walked into the living room. Dust floated in thin beams of light that filtered through the curtains. She moved slowly, opening the cabinet beneath the television. Inside, a small collection of photo frames leaned against each other like tired books. She took one out, a family portrait from years ago. Michael had his arm around her shoulder. Diane stood beside him, smiling, with a younger Abby perched on her hip. They had all been laughing. She wiped the glass with the hem of her sweater and placed the frame on the mantel. It didn't feel like the right place anymore, but she didn't know where else to put it. Then she heard a small chime. Her phone lit up again, not a call, but a message from Abby. "Ba oibo me ko jian gi ba kung." Margaret stared at the text for a long time, her fingers hovering over the screen. What could she say that she didn't know? That she had become a stranger in the very story she helped write? She didn't reply. Instead, she picked up the pink scarf from the arm of the couch and folded it neatly, pressing it flat with slow, deliberate movements. Then she rose, meaning to put it away, but her hand brushed the edge of the coffee table. The phone slipped. It hit the floor with a sharp crack. Margaret stood frozen. The screen had shattered. Fine lines spidered across it, black, bleeding through the glass like ink on wet paper. She didn't bend to pick it up. She simply stared as though the device were no longer hers, as though it belonged to someone else, someone younger, someone more welcome. Outside, Molly barked. The sudden sound startled her. She shuffled toward the door, her heart thudding just enough to remind her she was still here. She opened it slowly. On the front step lay an envelope, no name, no return address. Just white paper with creases from being carried too long. She picked it up. Inside was a letterhead from a bank. The names printed in bold, Michael Turner and Diane Turner. When Molly barked, Margaret stepped to the door, only to find an unmarked envelope lying on the porch. Inside was a bank notice addressed to Michael and Diane. On the bank document, Margaret's name had been crossed out, replaced with the words, co-owner, Michael and Diane. She held the paper with both hands, the edges trembling slightly under her thumbs. The living room was unusually cold, though it was only a mild summer rain outside. The warmth seemed to have withdrawn not just from the house, but from her life. She glanced toward the photo frame on the mantel placed there just yesterday, the family portrait. Her fingers had wiped the glass clean with care. Now she stared at it again, asking the quiet, empty room, when exactly did I disappear from their lives? She didn't expect an answer. The couch creaked as she sat down, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The table in front of her was cluttered with old documents, bills, letters, notes from years ago, receipts so faded they were barely legible. Somewhere in this pile she hoped was a thread, a starting point, a trace of what had once been hers. She stood slowly and walked to the safe behind the hallway cabinet. The combination came back to her fingers like muscle memory numbers her late husband had picked their wedding day. Inside was a small folder of property documents. She pulled it out. No original will, no deed, just photocopies, blurry ones, and a folder marked Home Mortgage, dated nearly a decade ago. She opened it and paused. Her name appeared once, then again, but in faint ink, barely visible. The signature looked familiar, but distorted, as if it had been scanned too many times until it lost its sharpness, and perhaps its strength. She remembered that afternoon at the bank with Michael. He had smiled, told her it was just a formality. They just need your name on it, Mum. Standard stuff, nothing serious. I'll handle the rest. There had been a banker, an older man in a blue tie, who had said something about co-signers and three-way approval. But she hadn't listened closely. She had trusted, as mothers often do. Now, with the rain tapping gently on the window pane, she opened the manila folder again and began to write dates, questions, names. Her handwriting was slow but steady. Each letter seemed to pull weight behind it. The phone rang. Abby. Margaret hesitated, then picked up. "Hi, Grandma," the young voice chirped. "Do you remember that book you used to read me? The one with the bear and the moon?" Margaret's throat tightened. "I do," she said softly. "You always asked me to read the same page twice. The part where the bear wondered why no one came to his picnic." Abby giggled. That's because he forgot to send the invitations. Margaret smiled despite herself. "Did you need help with something?" she asked. "Yeah, history homework." "But are you okay?" There it was again. That quiet crack in the wall, small but visible. "I'm just reading some old papers," Margaret replied. "Do your parents ever talk about old things?" Abby hesitated. "Not really. Dad's always busy. Mom says it's best not to dwell." "I see. Okay, gotta go. Thanks, Grandma." The call ended. Margaret sat still for a long moment. Then she stood, walked back to the living room, and began rifling through the bottom drawers of the antique cabinet her husband once built. It was there, tucked beneath a pile of old holiday cards, a folded letter in her husband's unmistakable cursive. "If anything ever happens, open the red drawer in the attic." She stared at the words. The attic. She hadn't been up there in years. In the bottom drawer, she found a letter in her husband's handwriting. "If anything ever happens, open the red drawer in the attic." Margaret dragged the old wooden chair across the hallway floor, its legs groaning in protest. She positioned it beneath the attic hatch, steadying herself before reaching up to unlatch the door. A puff of cold, dusty air greeted her. Clutching the flashlight in one hand, she took a slow breath and began to climb. Her free hand trembled as it reached toward the red drawer, forgotten for more than 10 years. The attic hadn't changed. Dust clung to every corner, floating like ghosts in the narrow beam of light. The wooden beams creaked under her weight, and the faint scent of mildew mingled with something else, faint tobacco and old pine like her husband's jackets. She hadn't been up here since the week after his funeral. The drawer. Red. Scuffed. Tucked beneath a stack of yellowing newspapers and moth-eaten winter blankets. Her fingers hovered over the brass handle for a moment, then gripped it. It opened with a groan. Inside, a manila folder labeled "Confidential." ME lay atop a bundle of envelopes bound in a ribbon that had lost its colour. Her breath caught. Her husband's initials. She sat cross-legged on the floor knees, aching against the hard boards, and opened the folder. At the top was a document in thick cream-coloured paper, the original will. No signatures blurred, no photocopy distortions, just clear ink in her husband's familiar handwriting. It named her Margaret Elaine Dawson as the sole heir to the property. She blinked hard, once then again. Below it, another form signed but clearly marked, "For emergency filing only." A transfer of ownership. It bore all 3 signatures, hers, her husband's and Michael's, but had never been filed, and tucked in between them a small note, scrawled in uneven ink. "Don't let anyone take what you've built." She stared at it, the words blurry through her tears. Her husband's voice echoed in her memory, calm and resolute. He had always been cautious, sometimes overly so, but never without reason. Her arms wrapped tightly around the folder. She didn't cry loudly. The tears came without sound, slipping down her cheeks as her shoulders trembled. Not in grief, but in something else. A strange clarity. A strength she hadn't felt in years. Downstairs, the world kept moving. The dog barked faintly, the refrigerator hummed. But up here in this dusty attic, frozen in time, Margaret sat with her past, and finally her proof. The flashlight flickered, reminding her of the present. She wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, then carefully placed everything back into the folder. Standing was slower than she expected. Her knees argued, but her spine stayed straight. Back in the kitchen, the sun had nearly set. The light was dull and grey, casting long shadows over the table. She set the folder down gently. The phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Diane. Her heart skipped. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed accept. "Mom." Diane's voice was tight. "We need to talk. It's urgent." The phone rang. It was Diane. Margaret hesitated, then answered Mom. "We need to talk. It's urgent." Diane stood at the threshold with a smile so thin it could vanish with a breeze. "Do you still remember how to make tea the old-fashioned way?" Mom Margaret stepped aside, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Some things don't change," she said gently. but her eyes steady behind gold-rimmed glasses did not miss the tautness around Diane's mouth or the way her fingers clenched her handbag. Inside, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden lines across the hardwood floor. The tea tray sat between them, the old porcelain teapot steaming quietly as if trying to fill the silence. The scent of Earl Grey mingled with something sharper anticipation, perhaps. Margaret poured slowly. No rush. She placed a cup in front of Diane, then took her seat, folding her hands in her lap. "Your garden looks peaceful." Diane offered eyes, darting to the mantelpiece. "It keeps me busy," Margaret replied, taking a sip. Neither mentioned the anniversary party. The silence around it was too deliberate to be accidental. "I hope you've been well." Diane tried again. "Michael's been under a lot of pressure at work. And Abby's preparing for her college essays." Margaret smiled. "She's always been bright." Diane nodded. Her gaze flicked toward the credenza, where a red folder peeked out from beneath a lace doily. Margaret leaned slightly forward, resting her elbows on the armrest. "You said on the phone you wanted to talk." Diane cleared her throat. "Yes, it's about the house." Margaret waited. "There's been some updates." Diane continued choosing her words with care. "Some changes at the bank. They're asking us to re-sign a few documents. Just a formality. Something to consolidate ownership for clarity." Margaret tilted her head. "Oh," Diane pulled a folded envelope from her purse. "Just routine paperwork. Michael thought it might be easier if you handled it directly with us." "Of course," Margaret said. "But before I sign anything, I should review the originals. It's been so long, I'd hate to confuse things." A pause. Diane's smile tightened. Margaret stood, walked to the side table, and returned with an envelope of her own. She placed it softly on the table between them beside the teacups. "I still keep everything she said. Old habits. This is the original will. And a few other things your father-in-law left behind." Diane stared at it. Margaret sipped her tea. "I just don't want to make the same mistake twice." The room felt colder. "I should go," Diane said abruptly, standing so fast her chair screeched. "I'll talk to Michael. We'll be in touch." She didn't wait for a reply. Margaret rose, slowly walking her to the door without a word. Diane's heels clicked sharply down the porch steps. She reached her car, opened the door, but before sliding in, she pulled out her phone. From behind the curtain, Margaret watched. Diane's face, once calm, now looked sharp, focused. Her mouth moved fast. Her free hand gestured in the air. Whoever she was calling it wasn't casual. Margaret let the curtain fall. She returned to the table and refilled her teacup hands steady. Diane stood up quickly. "I'll come back later." And as she got into her car, Margaret saw her on the phone, her face suddenly serious. That night, as rain tapped against the window panes and thunder echoed in the distance, Margaret sat hunched at the foot of her bed. The lamp beside her bathed the room in a warm but flickering glow, casting long shadows over the floral wallpaper. She opened the folder. Her fingers moved carefully over each sheet, her eyes scanning the text line by line. Something was missing. She paused, counted again. The handwritten addendum, her late husband's note confirming her sole ownership of the property, was gone. She had seen it yesterday. She remembered the curve of his handwriting, the ink slightly faded. She'd even pressed it between 2 pages to flatten the crease. But now it had vanished. Her chest tightened. She flipped through the rest once, twice. Still gone. Standing up, she moved to the wardrobe and opened the lockbox where she kept the folder. The small metal latch hung slightly askew. The lock hadn't clicked properly. She never left it unlocked. She turned toward her dresser, where the key to the attic usually hung inside the second drawer. The drawer was open. The key was not where she had left it. It had been moved just slightly, but enough. Margaret sat back down the rain outside, now pounding harder. A sense of intrusion crept into her bones, not physical, but real enough. Someone had been inside. Someone had taken that page. Her phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. A message from Abby Grandma Mom came home today. She looked really strange, like she was scared or angry. Did something happen? Margaret stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then retreated. No, not yet. Instead, she pulled out a notebook from the bedside drawer and began writing everything she could remember from the missing page. The date. Her husband's handwriting. The exact phrasing. In the event of my passing, the home shall remain solely under Margaret Elaine Dawson's name. This is my explicit wish. She wrote slowly, carefully, her pen pressing deeper with each word. Then she folded the page, slipped it into an envelope, and hid it behind an old picture frame in the hallway, far from the obvious places. At least for now. Later that night, an email notification blinked on her screen. It was from the local bank. Subject meeting request. Property ownership clarification. The list of attendees included Michael and Diane, but not her. Her heart sank. She picked up the phone and dialed the bank directly. A young woman answered. "Thank you for calling Willow Bank. How may I help you?" "This is Margaret Dawson. I received an email about a meeting regarding my property, but I wasn't listed." A pause. "Oh," the receptionist said, clicking something in the background. "Let me check." I'm afraid your name hasn't been on the primary ownership file since, let me see. Yes, since last month." Margaret gripped the edge of the desk. "That's not possible," she said, her voice low. "I understand, ma'am. But according to our records, the ownership was consolidated. The request came through our system with all proper signatures, whose signatures I'm not authorized to disclose that, but you may request a legal review." Margaret didn't speak. Her eyes wandered back to the folder, its contents now incomplete. Something had shifted quietly, deliberately. She thanked the woman, hung up, and sat in silence, the rain continuing its relentless rhythm outside. Margaret called the bank. The receptionist said, "Oh, you've not been listed as a primary owner since last month." The next morning, Margaret wrapped herself in her old wool shawl, the one with faint lavender stitching along the edges. The wind had turned sharper, carrying with it the scent of dry leaves and winter. She locked her front door, checked her bag twice, then walked to the bus stop with determined steps. She didn't look back. It had been years since she'd been downtown, longer still since she'd last seen Harold Ferris, her late husband's oldest friend, and a lawyer who still ran a modest practice near the town square. He was the one mentioned in the letter, the one James had trusted in case anything ever goes sideways. The bus was nearly empty. Margaret sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, the folder tucked safely under her arm. "Don't let them take what you built." Her husband's words echoed in her mind. When she arrived, the law office looked exactly as she remembered: wood-panelled walls, a brass nameplate, slightly tarnished, and an old typewriter sitting proudly on a dusty corner table. It was as if time had respectfully waited here. A young woman greeted her at the front desk. "Mrs. Dawson?" she asked gently, glancing at Margaret with polite curiosity. "Mr. Ferris is expecting you." Margaret offered a small smile. "Thank you, dear." Inside, Harold Ferris rose from behind a cluttered desk, his frame thinner hair greyer, but his eyes still sharp beneath thick glasses. He reached out both hands warmly. "Margaret, it's been too long." They exchanged pleasantries, Loss's time memories, before Margaret opened her folder. "I need your help, Harold," she said, simply laying the papers on his desk. Ferris scanned the documents, adjusting his glasses, flipping slowly through the pages. She sat, silently watching him, the ticking clock on the wall marking each second with stern clarity. After several long minutes, Ferris leaned back. "Well, he said the original will is sound. Dated, notarized, witnessed, all valid. And this—" he held up the copy of the revised deed. "This raises questions." Margaret clasped her hands tighter. "Can they do this without telling me they can try?" But legally, he shook his head. "No, not if we act." He tapped the papers thoughtfully. "Margaret," he asked, his voice quiet, "do you want this resolved quietly or thoroughly?" She looked up at him. Her voice was firm. "I don't need noise, but I won't let myself be erased." Ferris gave a small nod. "Then we begin." He reached for a pad of paper and began writing. "I'll draft a formal notice. We'll send it to both Michael and Diane requesting an immediate explanation. It'll make them think twice before trying anything else." She exhaled slowly. Not relief, not yet, but something steadier. As he worked, the young secretary reappeared with a cup of tea, setting it down gently beside Margaret. She offered a kind smile, as if sensing the silent storm beneath Margaret's calm face. Ferris stood handing her a signed document. "This gives me temporary authority to act on your behalf. Nothing drastic, just oversight." Margaret took the pen and signed. Before she left, Ferris stepped closer and spoke in a low voice. "Margaret, I fear this might not just be about the house." She blinked. "What do you mean I'll look into a few things?" he said. "Something about the dates, the bank filings. I don't want to jump to conclusions. But, but if there's something else, money transfers, maybe more, we'll find out." She nodded slowly, gripping her bag. "I trust you, Harold." He smiled. "And James would be proud of you." Margaret stepped out into the cold air, her shawl flapping slightly in the wind. She didn't feel victorious. But for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. Ferris said quietly, "I fear this isn't just about the house, Margaret. I'll look into it." That night, Margaret climbed the attic stairs once more, flashlight trembling in her hand. The air was colder than usual, still and stale, as if the space itself had been holding its breath. Rain tapped steadily on the metal roof, rhythmic and unnerving. She pushed open the attic door. Her fingers brushed over the red drawer's worn handle, then slid along the side wall to the old safe tucked beneath the rafter. The combination clicked into place with ease. But when she pulled open the door, the hollow echo struck her first. Then the sight. Empty. Every folder, every letter, every legal document. Gone. She didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She simply stared. For a moment, the beam of the flashlight flickered, then steadied. She stepped back, knees stiff-mined, suddenly clear, in a way that felt unnatural. So it's begun, she thought. Downstairs, Molly growled softly from her corner, as if catching a scent on the wind. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She remembered something Abby once said: Molly never growls unless she hears footsteps at night. She also remembered Michael asking offhandedly last year, "Where do you keep that old attic key? Mum, I used to love playing up there." At the time, she'd laughed. She wasn't laughing now. She dialed Ferris immediately. It rang once, then twice. "Margaret." His voice was low, concerned. "They're gone," she said. "Everything in the safe. The will. The emergency file. Even James's letter." A pause. "I'll come by tomorrow morning," Ferris replied. "Don't touch anything else." She hung up her fingers, trembling only slightly. Back in the living room, Margaret walked toward the bookshelf. Something tugged at her memory, something misplaced. She removed a faded photo of her James and a toddler-aged Michael at the beach. Behind it, folded tightly and pressed flat, was a single paper sleeve. Inside a copy of James's original will, one he'd given her long ago as a just-in-case. It wasn't as current, but it was something. She sat down at the kitchen table. Rain still beat softly on the windows. Margaret began to write. Line by line, she documented everything she could recall about the missing documents, the signatures, the seals, the handwritten notes from her husband. When she finished, she scanned the pages using the app Abby once installed for her and emailed them straight to Ferris. Then she cleaned up the table, made herself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat in silence. The knock at the door came just after 10. Startled, she opened it cautiously, only to find no one there. But on the doormat, a thick manila envelope sat slightly damp from the rain. No name, no sender. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink smudged slightly along the edges. In the center, bold handwriting read, "Stop now. Don't make this worse." Her breath caught, not fear, not quite. It was something colder, deliberate. Margaret folded the note, locked the door behind her, and pulled all the curtains shut. Her fingers moved with steady purpose as she picked up the phone and dialed Ferris again. When he answered, she spoke evenly. "Ferris, I think I'm being threatened." Margaret took a slow breath, locked the door, drew the curtains, and picked up the phone. "Ferris," she said calmly, "I think I'm being threatened." The table was set for 4. A bowl of warm potato soup, slices of golden toasted bread, and a steaming teapot of mint tea sat quietly at the center. The late Sunday sun streamed through the curtains in thin bars of gold, casting long shadows across Margaret's modest kitchen. She wore her soft blue cardigan, the one Michael liked when he was 10, and a faint layer of lipstick. Not for them, for herself. They arrived together. Diane's heels clicked sharply on the tiled floor. Michael followed, carrying awkward tension in his shoulders. "Smells just like it used to," he said, forcing a smile. Diane nodded once looking around. "Nothing's changed." "No," Margaret replied gently, "some things don't." They sat. The clinking of spoons and quiet sips filled the silence. No one asked about the invitation. No one mentioned the party. Margaret ladled soup into Abby's bowl. "Did I ever tell you about the time your father nearly got lost at the county fair?" Abby perked up. Michael gave a faint chuckle. Diane's spoon paused mid-air. "He was 5, Margaret continued. "I turned around and he was gone. I ran hot in my throat. But when I found him, he said, 'I knew you'd come. You always do.'" She smiled faintly. "That day, I held his hand so tight my fingers hurt for hours." Michael cleared his throat. "That was a long time ago." Was it Margaret's eyes met his? Time doesn't erase the feeling of being left behind. Silence. Diane shifted in her seat. "Margaret, we wanted to ask. There's been some updates with the house title. The bank made an error. We need a fresh signature, just a formality." Margaret picked up her teacup, took a long sip, and placed it down carefully. "I see," she said, then added with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "I'll take my time reviewing the old documents before I sign anything. Just to be sure I understand it all." Michael looked uneasy. "Mum, what do you mean?" She leaned back slightly. "Do you remember Mr. Ferris, your father's old friend, the lawyer?" Diane's eyes narrowed. "He's still around." "Oh yes," Margaret said softly. "Sharp as ever. He's helping me understand what I might have missed." A beat. Diane stood abruptly. "If you don't cooperate, you're putting us in a very difficult financial position." Margaret's hand rested on the table, calm and steady. No. I'm making sure I don't disappear from the life I built. The silence that followed was sharp enough to slice through bread. Then Abby, quiet until now, turned to her grandmother and asked Grandma, "Did Mom do something wrong?" 3 sets of eyes froze. Margaret smiled gently at her granddaughter and reached over to adjust her collar. "We all make mistakes, sweetheart," she said. "But some of us pretend we haven't." The morning air was crisp and bright. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains in Margaret's reading nook, casting gentle patterns over the bookshelves, lined with worn paperbacks and fading hardcovers. Abby stood in the doorway, hesitant. "I just forgot something," she said quickly, eyes avoiding her grandmother's. Margaret smiled without pressing. "Of course, dear. You know where everything is." Abby walked quietly into the room, stopping at the low shelf beside the armchair. Her fingers traced along the spines until they landed on a faded copy of Little Women, the one Margaret used to read aloud when she was a child, nestled beside her with a blanket and warm cocoa. She pulled the book from the shelf and flipped it open. A soft flutter, a folded envelope slipped out and landed at her feet. She picked it up. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly smudged with age. Her name wasn't on it, but neither was anyone else's. For a moment she stood frozen, then slowly unfolded the letter. "If Margaret is reading this, then I may not have made it to keep my promise. But this house, this life is yours. You built it. You filled it with warmth, patience, and forgiveness. You've held everything together when I couldn't. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Love Thomas Abby's fingers trembled slightly as she folded it back. Her lips pressed together in a silent line of thought. She didn't understand everything yet, but something about the letter, about the way her grandmother had never raised her voice, never defended herself, felt suddenly very loud. She slipped the letter into her school bag. The next day she returned again. This time she said nothing. She simply placed the old Little Women back onto the coffee table and walked into the kitchen to hug her grandmother. Margaret noticed the book. She noticed it was open to the middle, the pages uneven. She didn't ask. Instead, she poured them each a cup of tea. As they sat quietly, Abby finally spoke. "I think if someone spent their whole life holding everything together for other people, they deserve to keep at least one thing of their own." Margaret's eyes didn't fill with tears, but her hand reached out gently, covering her granddaughter's. The phone rang. She picked it up. "Margaret." "It's Ferris," came the low voice on the other end. "I found something. There's a mortgage on the house. It was filed recently under Michael and Diane's names. You're not listed anywhere." Rain tapped against the windows like a slow drumbeat. The room was dim, lit only by the grey light filtering through the curtains. Margaret sat with her hands folded, waiting. Ferris arrived right on time, his overcoat damp, his briefcase clutched tightly. He stepped in and gave a brief nod, then pulled a thick stack of colour-printed documents from his bag. "You need to know what you're up against," he said, his voice low but steady. Margaret didn't flinch. He laid the files across the coffee table, opening the top page to reveal a mortgage agreement, signed not once, but twice. "Your house was mortgaged 2 separate times," he explained. "First in March last year, then again 3 months ago. Here, see this. It lists the property as anticipated inheritance. That's not just dishonest, it's premeditated." Margaret leaned in. Her eyes scanned the signatures. Diane's name, Michael's name, but never hers. "I never signed these," she said quietly. "They didn't even ask." Ferris nodded. That's why this is serious. The funds, both loans, were transferred into an investment account under Diane's name, a high-risk private fund by the looks of it. And if I expose this, Margaret asked, her voice still calm, but with steel beneath. They could lose everything, Ferris replied. Reputation, jobs, possibly even their freedom, depending on how the court interprets the fraud. The room fell into silence. Even the rain seemed to pause. Margaret picked up one of the documents, her fingers brushing over her son's signature. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Then it's time, she said. Time I stop being silent. Ferris didn't respond right away. He packed up the copies and slid a single envelope across the table. I can send this warning letter formally, he said. Or you could deliver it yourself. She looked up. When she asked. He held her gaze. On the anniversary of your husband's passing. Margaret sat back slowly, the storm still whispering behind her. Outside, the world was wet and grey. Inside, something was finally sharpening into clarity. The late afternoon sun cast golden beams through the curtains, pooling onto the polished table set for four. Margaret had prepared everything as she had that first year, after her husband passed soup roast, his favourite rye bread mint tea, in the same chipped ceramic pot. A photograph of him stood on the altar, newly cleaned, framed by fresh lilies. They arrived quietly. Michael with his head slightly bowed. Diane with her usual cool mask. Abby trailed behind her eyes, darting between faces. They ate with minimal talk. Forks scraped softly. Tea was poured. No one reached for a second helping. After the plates were cleared, Margaret stood and placed a white envelope in the center of the table. I'd like to say a few words, she began, voice low but steady. Today we remember the man who built this house, not just the walls, but the life in it. Michael shifted. Diane crossed her arms. Margaret opened the envelope and slid the contents across the table. Pages with highlighted sections, dates, and bank stamps. These, she continued, are the choices you've made with this house. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. Michael flushed, sweat forming along his hairline. Mum, it wasn't like that. We were going to tell you. It was just temporary. An investment. Margaret didn't blink. She reached beneath the table, unfolding a weathered letter, and began to read aloud. If you're reading this, Margaret, I might have failed to keep my promises. But this house, it's yours. You held it all together. Don't let anyone take that from you. Her hand trembled slightly at the end. She folded the letter eyes, never leaving Diane. I've lived long enough to know the difference, she said softly, between someone who builds a home and someone who quietly removes brick after brick. Silence. Even Diane's lips, pressed thin, couldn't speak. Abby stood now beside Margaret, silent but watchful. Margaret turned to her son. You have 48 hours, she said, to undo the damage. Or the law will finish this conversation for me. She stood still for a moment longer, then gently gathered the empty teacups. The sound of porcelain against porcelain echoed louder than any raised voice. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, the balance had shifted. 2 days had passed since the memorial dinner. The house stood still, wrapped in a quiet so complete that even the ticking clock on the mantel seemed to echo like a heartbeat. No footsteps, no creaking doors, no conversations cloaked in motive, just the breath of an old house, learning how to exhale again. Margaret rose early as always. The sun had yet to burn through the fog clinging to the windows. She boiled water, placed 2 teacups on the table out of habit, but poured only one. Then she moved slowly through the rooms. She dusted the bookshelves, paused to reread a favourite line from an old poetry collection. She wiped the picture frames, replacing a faded photo of Michael as a boy back in its place. She folded the extra blanket on the sofa, smoothing out its edges. When the doorbell rang, it was only the mail. Inside the pile was a single white envelope with Michael's handwriting. She didn't rush. She read it while sitting at the table, her cup of tea still warm. Mum, I don't know when I stopped listening. I don't know when I started thinking of this house as something to use rather than something to honor. But I know you're not an obstacle. You're the last piece of this family that held us together. I'm sorry. Inside a notarized document, full transfer of the house's ownership back to Margaret. Signed. Witnessed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply nodded. Margaret placed the letter and the signed document into a new safe she had installed just days before. She locked it, then stood before her husband's portrait. I didn't let them take what we built, she whispered. Not even a brick. Then she turned and opened the windows. For the first time in weeks, sunlight swept across the floor, brushing against the table, the chair, her hands. No more hiding, no more waiting. Her phone rang. Hello? A gentle voice spoke. Is this Mrs. Margaret Jensen? I'm calling from the Heritage Institute. We recently reviewed the nomination files of Mr. Henry Jensen from 1985. He listed you as a legacy steward. Would you be open to speaking about your contributions? We'd love to honor you. Margaret stared out the window, the fog now lifting. Yes, she said simply. I think I would. The autumn sun filtered gently through the window panes, painting soft amber shadows across the living room floor. Margaret sat in her armchair beside the wide bay window, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. Outside, the maple tree blazed red and gold, its leaves trembling in the crisp morning breeze. It was the same tree she and Henry had planted decades ago when the soil was new, and their future even newer. She remembered kneeling in the dirt, laughing as he struggled to straighten the sapling, and the way he'd said, "Let's grow old with it." Now it stood tall, proud, like it had been watching over the house all this time. Margaret opened a leather-bound notebook on her lap. Its pages were clean, untouched. She hadn't written anything personal in years. Life had demanded too much of her raising, Michael surviving war, keeping the roof from collapsing after Henry passed. Her dreams of being a poet had long ago been folded away with her wedding dress into drawers she rarely opened. Abby arrived mid-morning, wearing a scarf too big for her slim frame and holding a takeaway cup. I brought the cinnamon one, she said. You always liked that. Still do. Margaret smiled, patting the seat beside her. They sat quietly for a while, sipping tea, watching the leaves fall like slow-moving confetti. Did you ever write? Abby asked softly. You know, poems, stories? Margaret tilted her head. When I was young, before everything, I used to think I'd write a book, something gentle, something that mattered. I think, Abby said, tucking her legs beneath her, you still can. And maybe you should. Margaret didn't answer right away. She only looked out the window, eyes following a leaf as it danced and landed quietly on the sill. That evening, after Abby had gone, Margaret opened the notebook again. She picked up her favourite pen, slightly faded gold, with Henry's initials still etched on the cap, and wrote the first line. This is not a story about an old woman. This is about a house that learned to speak. She paused, smiled faintly, and let the pen hover as more words began to take shape in her mind. A gust of wind stirred the maple tree, sending a handful of red leaves fluttering through the open window. One landed softly in her lap. Margaret looked down at it, then up at the tree. And for a brief moment, she felt something she hadn't in years, a quiet nod, a wordless yes carried on the breeze. The house that once echoed with unspoken wounds now stood in quiet resolve, sunlight spilling through windows that had long remained shut. Margaret never raised her voice, but every page she turned, every truth she unearthed, became a verdict no court could ignore. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody firm, echoing undeniable. Sometimes reclaiming your space is the most powerful form of resistance. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.